Board of Education for February 21st, 2021 is called to order. This meeting is being streamed live on PPS TV Services website. Welcome everyone to the work session on enrollment and program balancing. On January 23rd, the board voted to approve a feeder pattern into Kellogg for the 2021-22 school year. This was the first phase of work by the Southeast Guiding Coalition after several months of work to bring forward a recommendation to staff. Following that meeting, it was requested by several board members that we come together to answer some key questions prior to the onset of phase 2. Before we get started, I want to give you an overview of tonight's work session agenda. We will begin by identifying the most crucial issues we believe are the most important to address in the next 12 months. We will then need to identify the policies that require clarification so the staff and the Southeast Guiding Coalition can effectively and clearly complete phase 2. Next, it is critical that we, along with senior leadership, clarify what we believe are the most important strategic focus areas in the next 12 months. Finally, we need to identify what we would like to see as ways to engage students, families, and school communities during this next critical phase. So we've got those 3 jobs: looking at the critical issues and looking at the policies that we need to work on there, looking at the strategic focus, and then looking at engagement. Next, I'd like to introduce our Chief Engagement Officer, Jonathan Garcia, to lead us into this session. Chief Garcia.
Chair Lowry. Thank you, Chair Lowry. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you tonight. So my role tonight will be to facilitate your conversation as a collective. Really, I have 5 specific roles tonight. One is to guide the conversation to your desired outcomes, bridge builder to consensus, really wanting to make sure we reach consensus by the end of this session. And then, I'm going to be the taskmaster, so I'm going to hopefully keep session on track. And so we've allocated a certain amount of time for each section, so hopefully we can keep within that. I'm also going to be the motivator. I'm going to keep the dialogue and the conversation going. I may ask follow-up questions. I may may probe a little bit more to get more clarity. And then lastly, I'm going to be an active listener. So I'm going to be listening attentively to what you all collectively and individually have to say, as well as my colleagues. Some additional notes here before we get started. Megan Salvador is joining us from our Deputy Superintendent's office. She will be in the background taking detailed notes of today's conversation. And in fact, these notes will be shared on the screen after which will be carried live for folks to see her notes in real time. Joining me tonight from the staff will be Superintendent Guerrero, Deputy Superintendent Hertz, our Racial Equity Advisor, Danny Ledesma, our Enrollment Director, Judy Brennan, our Area Superintendent, Dr. Esther O, and our General Counsel, Liz Large. I don't think I missed anybody, but and sorry, Roseanne Powell, our Board Manager, are all joining us tonight. Each of us will be here to be mostly active listeners, but we'll be encouraged to add to the conversations throughout the discussion this evening. So today's agenda and conversation is yours collectively, but I want to highlight a few items in your agenda, which is shared with the public. The first thing that you'll notice in each section is time allotted to each section. The second thing you'll notice is the title. That will be what Chair Lowry just reviewed as the focus of each of the sections. Followed by, in each section, there's a desired outcome. This is what we hope you can accomplish in the set amount of time that we've allocated for the agenda. We also included some resources, so links to documents, policies, or information that is useful for the conversation. And then lastly, we included a set of guiding questions to each of the sections. These set of guiding questions might help you collectively accomplish the desired outcome outlined in the agenda. So a few ground rules before we get started, and I promise I'm going to turn it over to you now. A few ground rules that we've learned in our CEI training in many other spaces. Stay engaged, and I know that all of us will continue to stay engaged. Speak your truth responsibly. Listen to understand and to believe. Be willing to do things differently and experience discomfort, and expect and accept non-closure. So let's get started with an icebreaker activity to get us started. And each director will have 2 minutes to share. So our icebreaker is 6 of our 8 board of directors and the student representative are or will be PPS graduates. 7 are or were PPS parents. Can each of you reflect on what it was like to change or transition from schools, about a classmate that moved, joined your class, or the experiences of transitioning during your K-12 experience? Anybody would like to go first?
I'll go first. This is Director DePass. I had a really unique elementary experience, partly in PPS, partly outside of PPS in Mexico and in Venezuela, and partly in Catholic schools. But I had the most amazing high school experience. I did graduate from high school in Portland. I attended 2 high schools. I attended Jefferson because it had a really robust dance program. And I graduated from MLC, which had an agreement that you could do a dual enrollment, which was really great. I had an alternative high school education. I feel it served me really well. It provided a petri dish of like education, learning, experiential learning that was really important, having come from a strict Catholic school background prior to that. And the transitions, something that sticks out to me. So my graduating class was 32 students who I'm in contact with almost every week. I'll never forget meeting a Vietnamese student for the first time, and just someone that had come to this country, having experienced trauma, having been in refugee camps, and just welcoming him into our little tiny, small, close-knit community, and how incredible it was to start to open up my eyes around that experience. I think transitions are good for people. I feel like it's one thing to have gone to, been in a community and gone to a school all your life. And it's a whole other set of things that you develop from having to be the new kid and from having to be resilient. I feel like I've grown my resilient muscles from these experiences. It did not kill me. It exposed me to different languages and different ways of knowing. And, looking back, I used to always wish that we just stayed in the same neighborhood and went to the same school, and, it didn't work out that way. And I think it's okay. I'm really finding having built resilience around transition valuable. It's a skill that we're going to have to be resilient around climate change. And this is a skill that we're going to need to, our students are going to need to be resilient. They're going to need to learn how to manage change. And that's just a 21st century, maybe even 22nd century skill that we need to build. And I feel like I have a little bit of a head start on that. So thank you for indulging me tonight.
Thank you, Director DePass. Who would like to go next? I know this isn't a shy bunch.
I'll go next. I'm going to set a timer. You said 2 minutes. I know I sometimes talk longer than that. So I grew up in Salem Kaiser Public Schools. And when I was in 7th grade, seventh grade, the summer after 7th grade, we moved. And I moved from the sort of like, poorer side of Salem to the wealthier side. And like, I didn't have an Esprit bag or, Jordache jeans. And so there were parts of 8th grade that were really hard because I just, middle school is such a time of finding your peer group. And I felt like I didn't fit in. But when I started hanging out with the band kids that were in high school, and I found my tribe in 8th grade with those kids. And then when my middle school was attached to the high school, so we did things collaboratively between the music departments. And then by the time I was in high school, I had this group of band nerds that I got to hang out with. So I think one of the things is when you do make a change like that, it's finding your people, and whether they're folks like Director DePass who's willing to listen to that Vietnamese student, or if it's, other kids with the same passion, that's really important. And then my daughter we moved from Veneta, Oregon to Portland between 2nd and 3rd grade for her. And so, she was kind of the new kid in school. And as a parent, we had a popsicle social where they posted the teachers, that everybody had that year, and I was new. So I happened to hear some of the other moms on the field eating popsicles talking about one of the 3rd grade teachers. And I just am like, hi, I'm Ailey, I'm new. Tell me about 3rd grade. And now they're my friends. So I think as a 7th grader, I didn't have that skill set of just like introducing myself and insinuating myself into people's groups. But then as an adult, I did. And so had some things to help navigate an anxious child starting a new school because of that peer support group once again. So I think for me, it's always been in times of transition, finding people who are willing to hang out with you and guide you through the new experience and be your buddies.
Appreciate it. That was great. Right on time. Who would like to go next?
I can go next. So I grew up in, the same house from when I was born until 6th grade. And then we moved, and I was the youngest of 4 kids. We moved, and we only moved about 1.5 miles away, but it meant changing elementary schools. Everything was K-8 at that time. It meant changing elementary schools and then going to a different high school than my siblings had gone to, which really doesn't seem very traumatizing. Living in basically the same neighborhood. But that experience of changing schools, and I think particularly in adolescence, can be earth-shattering. And I remember that summer knowing who a few of the girls were that were going to be in my grade at my new school, and I would kind of like see them around town, and I was like an anthropologist, I was just kind of like watching them and seeing kind of how they interacted and what they wore and what was different about how things were at my old school and all of that. And, I guess my big takeaway is that things that can seem so relatively easy and minor from an adult's eye view are really a huge deal. And in the end, I totally agree with Michelle's point that those are the life skills that we all need. And none of our lives in any way are ever going to be on a predictable path or a controllable path. So those are the skills we need. But in my little tiny world at that time, it was a big deal.
Thank you, Director Constam. Who would like to go next?
So I'll jump in.
Oh, go ahead, Scott. No.
No.
You've got the better name, Scott. It's all you.
Andrew.
The Grant alum versus the Wells Barnett, the Wilson alum.
Well, this is
How about age before beauty?
pearls before and this is a story actually involves the school formerly known as Wilson. I grew up in Northeast Portland, was halfway through Grant High School when we moved to the west side. And what now is Wells Barnett High School would have been my school. And I chose not to make that transition. So I kept going to Grant, and which meant that my junior year, my parents would drop me off on the corner of Barber and Terwilliger. I'd walk across the freeway to the freeway entrance, and a Grant teacher would pick me up every morning. And going home at night after cross country or track practice was catching a bus sometimes at 5:30 and getting home sometimes at 7. But I got my homework reading done in any case. I do still remember the morning that I was waiting at that freeway entrance with snow and ice coming down, not knowing that school had been canceled. and my ride was not going to be there. So good times. And I'm glad, you know, it was kind of a mixed bag making that choice. But junior year was when I found, as Ailey put it, my tribe, and that was the cross country distance runners. So that was a hugely important thing for me socially, as somebody who didn't have a peer group that was working until then. And not to mention Coach Mark Cotton. There's my 2 minutes.
Director Bailey.
Thanks, Scott.
Director Scott.
So I'll jump. I actually have two experiences, one as a student and one as a parent. So I started middle school at Markham Middle School, back when it was a middle school. And I went there in 6th and 7th grade. And then my 8th grade year, it was a high school that had been shut down and empty for a while. So, you know, so the entire middle school, 6, 7, 8 went over to Jackson. And actually my experience with that was very positive, because Jackson was a great school. It was in really good condition, you know, relatively new, and it was huge because it had been built as a high school. And so, you know, having it as a middle school worked. I think the lesson I take from that though is I think one of the reasons it was so smooth is because we were the same cohort, right? So the entire middle school, 6, 7, and 8 moved as one. So the building changed, but the people we went to school with teachers didn't change, principal didn't change, et cetera. And so the importance of that cohort, I think, was really driven home as a student, because it's kind of a non-event in my life. I don't even really think about it except when someone asks. I'm like, oh yeah, that's right, we switched middle schools. My experience as a parent was a few years back. You know, both my kids were in the Odyssey Focus Option program and doing the Southwest boundary changes. You know, Odyssey had been at Hayhurst, which is walking distance from our house. And you know, one of the reasons why we looked into that school and was moving somewhere. And there was uncertainty during that process, ended up going up to West Sylvan, which is not walking distance to anywhere. What, you know, it was interesting, the overall experience at the end, you know, it worked out well, both for Hayhurst as a neighborhood school, which needed the room, and it worked out for Odyssey, which got its own building. I think the lessons I took from that, though, as you were asking this question, I was thinking back. One of those is the toxicity of social media. And, you know, these school communities in Southwest were relatively tight knit. And during that process, were torn apart. And torn apart, frankly, due to social media. And I blame Facebook almost 100% for that, for reasonable people becoming unhinged over rumors, over things they've heard, over just, you know, the inability to sort of talk to someone face to face, which of course we're getting better now in COVID, reading body language through a computer screen. But, you know, sniping remarks, it really became very toxic very quickly. And it became toxic within schools, it became toxic between schools. And really, I think what became very healthy was the ability to walk away from that, right? Is to say, I'm not actually even going to get my information there. I'm not going to go there. It's not healthy. It also really highlighted for me the importance of district communication and the need for that really factual, objective, very clear and very constant and frequent communication to school communities throughout the process. We, in the midst of the uncertainty about where we were going to go, had someone come to the school, to Hayhurst at the time, and sit in the cafeteria with us. And I wish I knew who that was, because I think it's probably someone who's still employed by the district, and spent an hour and a half with angry parents, answering every question, answering the questions they knew, answering the question and saying areas where we didn't know, and getting back, and then followed up with information afterwards. And that took the temperature down so many notches. And it was so helpful to sort of get that information directly. And it's driven home for me as we go through this process, that need. And I know that's something that came up in the first round, and I know we're going to be talking about today as well, moving forward, how we get that communication. So sorry, that was more than 2 minutes, but those are my two takeaways.
Appreciate it, Director Scott. We have two directors and the student representative.
Rita, do you want to go?
Yeah, I can go. I switched schools. So when I was going to school, it was elementary, junior high, and high school. So I switched schools for 5th and 6th grade, so went out of my neighborhood. And then for junior high and high school, I went to an all-city school. And so my experience was from the 5th grade on, I essentially lost connection with my neighborhood. And educationally, I think it was probably beneficial. I got to take 6 years of Latin, so there's that. But there was a cost. I really had no connection with people in my immediate area. So, you know, it was fine during school hours, but evenings and weekends, I was pretty much on my own. So that's turned out to be a real cost. It was great being able to, you know, the benefit was, you know, I got a good education and I actually did meet people from all over Boston. But there was some cost. So that's it.
So I grew up in Portland. I live in the house I grew up in. It was when they still had K-8s. And so I, for 9 years, walked with pretty much the same group of friends and my siblings down Belmont, a mile to Glencoe. So it was very much a cocoon, everybody from the neighborhood. I mean, the transfer policy at the time was, and there wasn't a lot of focus programs or anything. So you pretty much went to your neighborhood elementary school. So it was there for 9 years. And then when it came time to go to high school, the neighborhood high school at the time was Washington High School, which didn't have, for a whole host of reasons, a lot of kids in the neighborhood didn't choose it. So it had a very low capture rate for a variety of reasons. I mean, one, it was a horrible facility, just in terms, I mean, especially when you compared it to the brand new Jackson. So there were no home athletic events. I mean, it was an old building, but a lot of people didn't go there. And then in addition, at the time there was mandatory busing. And so there were kids also at Washington who, not by choice, but who were bused there. So it was an interesting group of people who showed up, and it was probably 2/3, 1/3 girls to boys. So because a lot of boys who could went to Benson, because that was sort of the opt-out if you didn't want to go to Washington. But what I found is, for me, it was, especially my freshman to junior year, is just a great, really affirming community. It was a smaller school, so about less than 1,000 students. And everybody had an opportunity to be a leader in something. And it was super diverse. So you had an opportunity to meet people that you wouldn't have met in your neighborhood. And then my senior year in high school, the school board at the time decided that Monroe, which was Girls Polytech, that used to be in the Da Vinci building, was too small. They were going to close it. So they just merged with my high school. And didn't do didn't do a very good job, because there was just this sort of two clashing cultures in your senior year. It was a hard senior year because the district really didn't bring the two school communities together. And so very much we had like a graduating class of the Monroe seniors and then the Washington seniors. So I've kind of seen what happens when you don't knit cultures together, or make an attempt to knit cultures together, and kind of what it can do to a school community. So I was the first graduating class of Washington Monroe. The Bruins, for whatever reason, we became.
And I think that leaves us with Nathaniel, right?
Nice. So you all might be surprised to hear this, but I'm actually not done with my K-12 education at PPS. During my time here, I've been at 3 of our schools, Ainsworth, Portland Village Charter, and Jefferson. I haven't had to transition between schools too often, and when I did, it's been at more traditional stop points. I entered Ainsworth in kindergarten. I moved between Ainsworth and Portland Village at the end of 5th grade, and between Portland Village and Jefferson at the end of 8th. In general, I think the transitions were beneficial for many of the reasons that Director DePass mentioned. Didn't have any significant trouble in any of these transitions, although they weren't perfectly seamless. Moving between Ainsworth and Portland Village was probably the most daunting of these, for the most part. As that school was a K-8, and well, it still is a K-8, I was entering a pre-established class with pre-existing social dynamics in which I only knew one person, which was, of course, challenging both for that year and many years following. I haven't experienced too much turnover in my classes. At Ainsworth, very few of my class left or joined the cohort. At Portland Village, most of those who moved were those who left after 6th grade. And at Jefferson, most movement has been out of the school, not into it, although that has been a relatively minor portion of the class. I think that's about it.
Chief Garcia, before we move on, I just want to say that during my comments, I used the word tribe to describe kind of a community and people that I found. And it's a word I'm actually trying to delete from my vocabulary because I know that for some Native folks, using it that way can be really offensive and is appropriating a Native life way. So I want to apologize for using that. And I think for all of us who are on an anti-racist journey, we make mistakes. And there are times when, even though we know better, when we're just in the flow of talking, a word comes out that's part of our lexicon that is something that, so I just wanted to draw attention to that word and that it's something I'm trying not to use and admit the mistake of having used it in this conversation.
I want to just say, appreciate you for recognizing that. And yes, I mean, we also use the word chief and tribe and Native. And so just if we're conscious, I think that's great. I appreciate you recognizing and interrupting yourself in the moment.
Yeah, Ailey and I both did a kind of a head smack there. So apologies.
I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate we all appreciate you all sharing, 2 minutes of your life, not even your life story, but 2 minutes of your story. And it was really powerful, at least for me as a facilitator and as someone who's gotten to know many of you for the years. I heard this how might we build resilience, right, as students, as we're navigating change. Talked about how we all need to find our people, right? And many of you talked about finding our people. Talked about how, questioned about how can we truly be student-centered and really think about the student gaze, if you will, and how do we approach our work through that student perspective. We talked about living into our core values around relationship, right? Relational trust. There was conversations around that. And the importance of relational trust with leaders in the district and having clear communications. That was loud and clear. There was also topics around the importance of our neighborhoods in our community and the importance of our next door neighbors in shaping who we become, right? And at the end of the day, I think one of the most powerful things that I heard was, at the end of the day, it's the experiences and the outcomes that happen in the classroom and in the hallways of our schools, right? Those experiences, those opportunities are instrumental. So I really appreciate, again, you all sharing your and being part of this icebreaker. So with that, we are now running 15 minutes behind schedule, but we'll catch up by going to the next topic, which is the prioritization on PPS enrollment and program balancing. So I'm going to read the desired outcome and then the 2 guiding questions, and then really I'm going to open it up for someone to kick us off. So really during this 30-minute section, board, we really would love for you to help identify the critical issues you believe are the most important to address in the next 12 months. And so in your agenda, we identified or we included 5 identified enrollment and balancing related focus areas that folks or the conversations have been had over the course of the last year. There might be additional. I'll leave it to you to play to have that conversation. The 2 guiding questions that we'll be focused on today is what is the most important issue to address in the next 12 months for us as a PPS school board, and why? In other words, if we refine that question chronologically, which do you recommend as the first step in why? So I'll really let you kind of think about that question. And then secondly, are we looking to address more than one of these issues? And if so, why? So with that, who would like to get us started?
Jonathan, kind of before we dive in, I just want to acknowledge the email that we received from the, I think it's the vast majority of the members on the Southeast Guiding Coalition with some items of clarification that they are really expecting from us. And I, for one, think those were all fantastic questions. And I fully agree that if we're going to ask them in their volunteer role to help us do this hard work, we owe it to them to have to provide guidance on the questions that they put to us. So I'm just putting that out there now because I don't know when we want to specifically revisit those questions that they asked of us.
Yeah.
So I'll jump in to get the ball rolling. One, I think ultimately all 5 of those priorities are important and worthy goals of as we go forward. We have committed to converting K-8s to K-5 middle schools. That's, a big piece of what we're doing in Southeast. And as a result of that, there's no way around it that we have to adjust boundaries. Even apart from that, and this is part of some information that I shared with the policy committee, is that we have a lot of schools that are either over-enrolled or under-enrolled. And that has impacts on students and staff. It has impacts on, we have certain thresholds around funding of ancillary position, not ancillary positions, they're key positions in the schools around, for example, library services, counselors that depend in part, our office staff, that depend in part on enrollment. So there's all sorts of issues around that besides just the physical feeling of being in an overcrowded building. So those are all important features of our current imbalances, and there's huge equity issues around all of those. So, and so those 2 off the top, but as part and parcel of that is also having a stable, continual enrollment pattern for our students receiving special education services. We've, over the years, I think we've all talked with parents who had their kids follow a zigzag pattern. It was impossible for them to keep part of a peer group all the way up through high school, and we really need to address that. So again, I think all 5 of these are important and they're interwoven. The high school piece, I think we can probably delay a bit because we have an important conversation coming up with the Jefferson community about what's Jefferson going to look like in the coming years. And that's I think we need to have that discussion and come to some decisions to see how it affects the rest of the system in terms of balancing high school enrollment. So I'll just lay that out there and see who's
Really,
listen to
Director Bailey,
the rest of you.
Director Bailey, that was a good overview. I think really situated all the different issues. If I may, as you think about those issues, those 5 issues, the question here is, what do you think is the most? I mean, so I think what you outlined was middle school reconfiguration, number 1, boundaries 2, 3 SPED, and then long-term high school. Can you think about, as you think about the next 12 months, what can we accomplish, or what is the most top priority for you?
Well, to me, it's all part of the same process. And I didn't mention the co-location around dual language immersion programs. And again, around in terms of equity, if you look at native speakers enrolled in dual language immersion programs in Southeast, with some exceptions, most of them do not live in the neighborhood catchment area of the school they attend. And that to me is an issue. When we talk about the importance, for example, of walkability in terms of serving students, we're essentially busing lower income kids of color for the most part out of their neighborhood into a different neighborhood for them to get the services that are so important to their school success. So all these issues, if we're going to continue to work on that middle school conversion, of necessity, we run into boundary issues. So it's not a 1-2, it's all integrated.
Got it.
I think I want to pick up on what Scott said for a second. This is gonna when you're asking sort of the question, what's the most important? When I look at these 5, right, I think they're all important, and ideally the charge, to the Southeast Guiding Coalition, the charge to us as a board is to come up with a solution that maximizes all 5. And Jonathan, what I hear you saying, and it's important, is okay, but what about those situations where we can't, right? Because obviously if there's a solution that hits all 5, that's the solution we're going to go with. That's easy. It gets really hard if there's a solution that hits 1 or 2, but doesn't hit the other 3. But I think my question becomes, do we know that, or can we know that for all circumstances ahead of time? Right. And what I hear you saying, and this is going to sound a little like a dodge, and I don't mean it to sound like a dodge, because I think it is our job as a board to give the guidance in terms of which of these to prioritize. But I'm wondering if, as we go through this and we're looking at different schools in different situations, if in fact we might end up prioritizing different things for different situations. That I'm not sure we can take a blanket and sort of say, in all situations, these 3 are the top priority and these 2 are lower. There may be situations where we sort of reverse that and say, you know what, we actually are going to change that. Now, as Andrew, I'm saying that,
it's Ailey. I think what we're doing in this exercise is saying, what do we want the Southeast Guiding Coalition to focus on in the next 12 months? How do we want them to focus their work?
Right. And what I'm actually saying is, I don't think in my mind we can give them a blanket scenario that and say that in all circumstances, these are the 1, 2, or 3 things we want you to prioritize above these others. What I'm wondering if there's not a process that allows for some iterative conversation, right? So one of the things that became really clear in this last process, right, is that there were certain things, direction that we as a board had given the coalition, that they came to an impasse, right? And they sort of said, well, when it's a conflict between converting a K-8 or overcrowding, what direction do we go? they were left at a loss because we hadn't given them direction. I hear what you're saying, and I think it's really valuable. So I'm not trying to get away from the priorities. If we all say, oh, K-8 is always going to take precedence over overcrowding, well, that's really clear guidance. What I'm saying is I'm not sure we should be doing that at this point, given all the unknowns and all the variables. I'm wondering if there's not a way that when those points are reached, they will be, that there's not some iterative conversations where the coalition comes back to the board and says, we're at an impasse because you've told us to focus on K-8, you've told us to focus on overcrowding, we have to pick one or the other. If that's not a moment for the board to then weigh in and say, okay, in this situation, we would prioritize X over Y.
Which is actually what we just did with Creston, because it was a conflict of our stated guiding values.
My example was not completely drawn out of thin air. That's true.
Yeah, I think another dimension to this, and we haven't talked specifically about lessons learned from the phase 1 process. I think the questions that the Southeast Guiding Coalition have posed to us are a big part of that lessons learned. And a piece of that, where the phase 1 initially kind of came to a head, was around dual language immersion programs. And I think they have rightly said, we're not professional educators. You guys are, meaning staff, not the board. We need you to make the call here. This is not our call. I think there's a couple of other nuances to that of what do we ask for guidance on from a citizen group versus what are the things that staff as professional educators need to say, hey, our experience is that this is the best way to provide these services, and make the call there.
I see this a little differently. I see that this is something the board is asking to do. This is not something that our educational team has come to us and said, this is the thing that will help us be the most strategic towards the outcomes you have asked us to move towards, right? So this enrollment and balancing is more of a board directed process. And so I think, for us to say, we want you to do this process, we're not going to prioritize. I mean, I'm hearing what all of you are saying, that these are all interrelated. But for me, if I was to say, okay, in the next 12 months, the priority would be, for me, it would be finishing the middle school piece and then working on the elementary boundaries related to that middle school balancing. And then my third would be the special education piece, right? And I don't know if we can get to that within a year. And I know that when we make some choices, it is all interrelated. So if we make some choices around middle school and elementary, that will have an impact on the special education feeder pattern. But that's why I think we need to prioritize and say where we are in the work and the scope of where we're going next. We need to finish middle schools. We need to look at balancing those elementary schools so they support the middle school population in a thoughtful way, and then do special education, because we'll continue to do this process. So I think we really do need to give the coalition some guidance, because I think from what I've heard from coalition people is it feels a little bit like they're kind of unmoored and trying to discern what the board wants in this process. Because again, it is our process. So that's how I look at it in this moment of what those priorities are.
So can I invite another? Go ahead,
Sorry,
Director Constance.
Chair Lowry, I think I'll just build off of what you just said and get super pragmatic, which is we have to constitute Harrison Park as a middle school. That's priority number one. And then we have to figure out how to balance enrollment at the K-8s that we just sent to Kellogg and that we're going to send to Harrison Park. So for me, in terms of very pragmatic priorities, those are the two things that we know that we have to do. Regarding the special education classrooms, I want us to be continually thinking about who they serve, how many students they serve, and why they serve them. And to what extent can we improve the services that we provide for our special education students in every single one of our neighborhood schools? I don't want us to just assume that we have a fixed number of behavior classrooms and that they're in these fixed locations now. I want us to be continually revisiting that question with an eye toward delivering equitable education available to all in every one of our neighborhood schools, and look at it also in parallel with the investments that we're making under this bond and with the timeline for those investments in terms of physical accessibility issues, so that we don't continue to have a segregated lens for a certain group of our special education students.
Thank you, Director Constam. So we are about halfway through this conversation. I just want to, yes, I will. I just wanted to make sure we're a halfway point. There is kind of a conversation happening here around a prioritization around finished middle schools and the elementary school boundary. And then there was a specific, even more targeted from Director Constam. But go ahead, Director Brim-Edwards.
Yeah, so I'm going to be like, well, just be provocative. You know, I think we're going to be almost at capacity from a staff and a board, and just coming out of the pandemic, you know, surrounding our students and our school communities with a big warm embrace and bringing them back in, and, you know, returning to, you know, the world they knew a year and a half ago. So I don't know that we have a lot of capacity to, like I say, it's not that these are not the right things to do, but I think it's going to be very hard, because I think some of these things are going to be, I'll just take like the co-locations of neighborhood and DLI programs. I mean, that's going to require a lot of community engagement, or to move boundaries, and engaging the community in the middle of a pandemic is awfully hard. So I just want to put that on the table. I want to be cognizant that I think we have staff and our school staff have some really hard work and important work to do to help our students return to a normal school experience, and, you know, heal from what we've all been through. So I just put that to start with. You know, I would say absolutely critical. So I'd narrow the scope of what we would need to do. It's absolutely critical to open in Harrison Park. The fact that we had a whole host of K-8s where kids got an inequitable middle grades experience, and outer Southeast, you know, that needs to end. So that would be my priority. And we also have, we've some chronically under enrolled schools because of actions by the district, and whether it's the Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School, or schools in outer Southeast that don't have enough students to offer a really robust programming that most other schools have that have higher enrollments. I mean, that would be sort of my secondary priority, or it should be done at the same time. And then I think that the rebalancing the high school enrollments is not a Southeast Guiding Coalition responsibility, because that implies that you can balance the high schools in one quadrant. And the reality is the biggest inequity among our high schools is, you know, that Jefferson High School doesn't have a neighborhood boundary. And so I don't think there's any way to have that conversation in one quadrant. So I would say that's a, you know, as we roll out the new high schools and we look at it from a citywide perspective, but I certainly don't think that that's a Southeast Guiding Coalition responsibility. And on the special ed, I think I'm going to agree with Director Constam that I view that as an ongoing process versus that we should have a district-wide approach, and that it's not a, again, I wouldn't say it's a Southeast Guiding Coalition, like we need you to make recommendations in this space. I would hope the district staff, the educators who are familiar with best practices and know what families want, is that we're continuously looking at those feeder patterns, but it's not like, hey, we can only change that when we're in a quadrant and when we're doing work. So that's, and I have a lot of thoughts about, and I didn't see this on the agenda, but I have a lot of thoughts about the phase 1 process. And I hope we're going to have a discussion, not tonight because there's more priorities, but about the process and how we do that, because we're going to put a tremendous stress on staff and school communities if we have a really intensive, broadly scoped process in the midst of a pandemic.
So Director Broome-Edwards, you started off by kind of saying that you're going to be provocative. Did anybody take that comment about we're doing this in the middle of a pandemic as a provocative statement? And if so, can you speak a little bit to that?
Well, can I just, why it's provocative is, like, I have a whole host of meeting invites that go till November. And I'm thinking, if I wanted to be engaged, that and the pandemic's not going to be over in the midst of that, is I just think I can't imagine that we could even do even a portion of this work and have any sort of real authentic community engagement in the midst of a pandemic.
Can I just ask a question on that? I hear that a lot here in the district. I hear it in other local governments. I also personally have experienced some really effective engagement, and I want to caveat all of this with it's, there are access issues, right? And they're very real, and we need to be aware of those. But I also feel like turnout at community meetings has been higher. The Zoom format allows for breakout rooms, allows for conversations. I mean, the meeting we had, hundreds of people in different breakout rooms, that we were able to attend. I don't disagree with you, Director Broome-Edwards, that it is challenging. I guess I also have been through so many engagement processes outside of a pandemic that no one ever pays attention to, or people can't make it to because it's a 6 o'clock meeting and they have to drive there and they've got other things to do. And I think there are tools that we can take advantage of in this moment that actually can lead to effective engagement.
Absolutely.
So
we'll get into engagement towards the end of the agenda today, and we can have that discussion. But I want to go back because we have about 8 minutes left. So where we are, so what I'm hearing, and again, I want to welcome folks to with a different opinion here, but what I'm hearing is a focus on converting Harrison Park into a K-8, and then any potential and balancing that we have to do at the elementary. No, we're not here. I'm not hearing that. We're just hearing a focus on K-8s. On
Harrison Park to what I was not shaking my head at is Harrison Park to a middle school and then elementary balancing. I thought you said switching Harrison Park to a K-8. And I was like, nope, that's backwards.
Yes,
I probably misheard you. Sorry, Jonathan. I'm very expressive, so just ignore me.
You're probably right. Thoughts on that? Please, Dr. Moore.
Yeah. So I think we have an emerging consensus that the primary focus should be on establishing the new middle schools in Southeast. And I agree with that. I would say I think maybe the second priority within that is addressing the issues that have frequently been present using the current DLI model. It sounds like, based on what I've heard during the Southeast Guiding Coalition meetings, it sounds like some of the DLI programs in Southeast, that the co-location has not been as tense in Southeast as it may be elsewhere in the district. But I still think we need to be looking at the DLI model we use. And to the extent we are going to continue to have co-locations, I think we as a district need to be really attentive about how we're implementing that. I think it becomes especially important at the middle school level because having a DLI program in a middle school dramatically complicates scheduling. I would say I tend to agree that we're probably not going to be able to rebalance the high schools in this process, mostly because I think I agree it really can't be handled quadrant by quadrant. For special education, again, I would like us to look at the model we're using for special education services. My concern, the enrollment issue is that because the current policy pretty much exempts special education services from any linkage to enrollment in the policy. What has happened historically is that special education programs tend to be the thing that is used. It's the mechanism that is used to relieve overcrowding. So the kids who most need predictability and stability are the ones who tend to be the ones experiencing the least predictability and security and stability. Then finally, around boundaries. So I'm going to be a little provocative here. I've spent a lot of time talking about boundaries and the problem of over-enrollment and under-enrollment and the consequences flowing from that for students' educational experience. So what I'm about to say is going to be, it's not going to be consistent with what I've said all along. I would say if we as a board and a district are not willing to stand by any decisions that are made around boundaries, then we might want to abandon the idea at this point. So based on Director Bailey last week produced a listing of schools that were over capacity and under capacity. It's 50 schools out of 82. That's a 61% rate of enrollment imbalance, mismatch between enrollment and building capacity, which we've had for years and years and years, generally. And in phase one, we made there was an effort to address potential over-enrollment, over-capacity at Kellogg. And board action unraveled that. So I would say, if we're not willing to have a process that tries, does its best to come up with a good faith effort to balance enrollments across buildings, and unless we are willing to stand by that in the face of, I would say, inevitable unhappiness from some school communities, maybe even all school communities, then I question why we're even going to make the attempt. I cannot express to you how uncomfortable it makes me to even say these things. But I think we need to be really honest with ourselves and with our families and with the Southeast Guiding Coalition. If they're going to make very difficult decisions, if we're not willing to stand by those decisions, then what are we doing?
So I hope you don't feel uncomfortable, because I think this is exactly the conversation we need to have. So thank you, Director Moore, for bringing it up directly. I'm going to take it back though to what I said at the very beginning, and let's go back and use that as an example. The Southeast Guiding Coalition prioritized the boundary changes around crowding over the conversion of K through 8. That was a very reasonable, legitimate outcome of their process. In the end, though, a majority of the board, not unanimous for sure, said that conversion of K through 8 was more important, and giving the middle school experience was more important than the overcrowding. I still have questions about the overcrowding, technical ones we can get into, whether it really changed it that much, but that was the priority issue. What I'm concerned about by this process is we are saying at the very beginning of phase 2, here are the priorities. We're going to stick with these throughout the entire process. And I will tell you, I'm uncomfortable with that, because to me, of these 5, I want to see them all, but some will inevitably come into conflict. And I honestly don't know enough about the variables of the specific schools and situations to say in all cases, you know, numbers 1, 3, and 5 will trump numbers 2 and 4. What I think is a better process, and what I think would have worked better in phase 1, is for the Guiding Coalition to come back to us and said, guess what? Overcrowding K to conversion in conflict. We want to flag that for you, board, because before we go any further in this process, we need some clear guidance. And I think the board at that time could have said, you know, yes, focus on the conversion, or yes, focus on the overcrowding. And I think the coalition would have felt better about that. They would have had clear direction, and the board in the end process would have felt better. I am not troubled by a board changing the decision of a coalition, as long as we're clear about our reasons and rationale. And I think, though, that what I don't want is that coalition to be frustrated by that, which is why I think these, again, figuring out these check-ins, what I wrote down back then when we considered this was, phase 2, we need to be willing to make adjustments to the coalition's charge as these issues arise. And I think that's going to be really important, because I think we're kidding ourselves if we think we can set a framework that will apply in every situation for the next, you know, however long this process is going to take.
So, Director Scott, if I may, to push back. So I hear what you're saying about, you know, the opportunity to make adjustments to the charge, but isn't that just moving the goalpost?
How so?
Because I think when I think about project management and I think about the desired outcome, I think you know, folks are driving towards a North Star. I think the roadmap will change as things progress, but I think what's clear is that having a vision or a North Star is going to be really critical for folks. And so without a clear guidance on that North Star, we might not get to that destination that you ultimately want to get to.
You know, I think if we could agree on one North Star, then you're right. If we, and you know, maybe, and Director Moore, I don't want to put words in your mouth. I think I just heard you put some real focus on the enrollment, you know, the boundaries and enrollment balancing part. I think, Jonathan, you're right. If 7 board members say, or frankly, just a majority of board members say, that is the overriding goal of this process, and we will, as a result, if we need to, hopefully we won't, but if we need to, we'll throw out the K through 8 school reconfiguration. Maybe we'll leave a K through 8 program. We're not going to worry about special education feeder patterns. We're not going to worry about DLI programs. We're not going to worry about high school enrollments. Whenever they come into conflict with that, then I think you're right. Then we've got a North Star. But I'm personally not willing to say that, because I have 5 North Stars, or maybe there's a Northeast Star and a Northwest Star. And, like, I want to drive towards all 5 of these. And I think we need to acknowledge the challenges here. It's not simple, right? We know that. Our coalition members certainly know that, diving into it. There are so many variables in each one of these schools and boundaries and all these decisions. And it was, I mean, as a relatively new school board member still, can I say that up till my 2-year mark? Is that, can I get away with that?
No.
No,
Yeah,
okay.
I think you can, actually.
All right, as a sophomore school board member, I was frankly, like, every time I dove into this, shocked at just another layer of variables, another layer of details, another layer of, oh, then there's this school, and then there's this program, and oh wait, you can't forget about this cohort, and you can't forget about this issue. So what that makes me think is setting rules from the very beginning that will be consistent throughout is probably unrealistic. But setting, and I'm not opposed to setting some goalposts, and maybe, Jonathan, that's what you're coming back to, that I'm overstating what we're trying to do here. So if what I'm hearing is, let's set some priorities now, but recognize those priorities can change as we go through the process, then I'm more comfortable with that. What I thought I was hearing is, let's set some priorities that we agree to stick with, come hell or high water, as we go through.
Dr. Moore?
I'm going to push back because I think if we don't establish some pretty clear criteria, given all of the complexity that you mentioned, I mean, every school is different. There are lots of layers to all of this. Given all of that, I think if the Southeast Guiding Coalition doesn't have some clear criteria to guide their work, I don't think they're going to be able to make any decisions about anything. And even if they do, if we're going to be willing to recalibrate the criteria as time goes on, I fear that we are not going to be able to look back on the process as being in alignment with our racial equity and social justice framework. Because I can tell you what's going to happen is that some school communities may be made unhappy by a decision or a proposal, and the schools that have the most resources are going to be the ones that will be most effective at advocating for their position. And the schools that have schools with families with fewer resources are not going to have the same capabilities. They're not going to have the same chance of advocating effectively for what's best for their kids. So I think we really do need to come up with some, maybe they can't be ironclad criteria, because there are going to be inevitable conflicts among them. But if I were a member of the guiding, I have been a member of similar community groups that were being asked to wrestle with some really vexing issues in the district. I don't know that I would be able or willing to tackle something of this magnitude if the board is not willing to set some pretty clear criteria at the beginning and then agree to abide by them.
So I think Director Bailey had his hand up, but before we do that, it is 7:13. The next agenda item, talking about layers of complexity, is the school board policies. And so we did schedule 40 minutes for that section. So by 7:50, if we can cover this conversation and the policies, then we'll take a 10-minute break and start the second half at 8 o'clock. So,
Jonathan Garcia, I also have one question for the board, but I'll wait my turn.
Please go ahead, Director Bailey.
First of all, I've weighed in a couple of times, so if there's any board members who haven't weighed in, I would let them go first. If not, I'll plunge ahead.
Appreciate that, Bailey, Director Bailey. And as you're doing that, I'm actually going to ask Megan to stop sharing the screen just so we can make sure everybody's watching each other. I think that there's our recommendation. So thank you. The notes are being taken and we will share those with all of you as well. So go ahead, Director Bailey.
Okay, so I want to say to Director Scott and Director Moore, I think you're both right. How's that? It's a dessert topping and a floor wax. I'm dating myself there. But I think in this case, we have some very specific asks from the coalition that need to happen before they can really proceed. And so that's one thing. A second thing is we had co-location of dual language immersion on the priority list for the guiding coalition. I think we should take it off of that list and ask staff to come up with a direction. And I think once staff puts that out, then I'm comfortable with the guiding coalition going from there. And having not hard and fast priorities from the board, but I think guidance. And again, if we have a little more time to do this process than the rush we were in this last year, time for the guiding coalition to check in with us at major decision points to say, okay, we're here. We could go this way, we could go that way. You guys want to give us some guidance? Now's the time. It is a way forward. And I also want to say on the capacity overcrowding issue, we got caught crosswise because the guiding coalition asked staff guidance for targets around capacity utilization. And they stuck to those targets. And one, I'm glad staff gave that direction. I think that was entirely appropriate. And two, we didn't really go into those and ask the questions we needed to before we push those aside. 100% is not 100%, 85% is 100%, and so on. But we didn't get into that, and we should have. So, we got crosswise with our staff on that, and that's on us and staff working that out. And that's a lesson learned that we need to correct going forward.
Appreciate that, Director Bailey. Claire?
So I have a question about that. We have quite a few K-8s that have now become K-5s, and we have some middle schools that are losing half their program going to another building, and one that's coming together and being formed. So they're under enrolled. And so especially with the K-8s becoming K-5s, there's quite a few of them all together. For us to increase the enrollment in all of those K-5s, we would most likely have to change boundaries all the way from the river to the east side of the district to accomplish enough students moving to get that accomplished. So it's I think when I look at the capacity of all the communities changing their boundaries together to accomplish that, it's significant in this region. So at the same time, another way to look at under enrollment, and something the district has done in the past, is consolidated some schools together that are on the small side and where there's enough capacity for them to fit in the neighboring school. So what I'm wanting to hear a little from the board on, because both of these would be very difficult for the community, but they're the solutions that we have available to us to help with the under enrollment that you're asking us to address. So I just wanted to hear some thinking about moving from west to the river to the east end of the district, moving all the boundaries to get to where you need the enrollment on the very eastern edge versus consolidating some schools that are small and close together.
Director Brim Edwards, you had your hand up. I don't know if you want to answer this or.
Well, I'm going to go back to just sort of fundamentally the work of the district, and we only have a limited amount of capacity. And I want the superintendent and senior staff and the school staff to be focusing on our school community healing and getting back on track. So I think there's what is urgent and needs to be done, and what can be done in a sequenced way, because I don't see all these things happening. I mean, it's the same group of people. And I think it's, and we really haven't talked about the priorities on the next page, but I look at that, and so I get down to what's critical to have happen, and where's like a unit of our deputy superintendent for business operations of here, or making sure all our buildings are healthy and safe, and keeping our bond program sort of on track, and all the other things. So I'm just really reticent to do everything right now. And I go back to when we started this project, obviously we weren't in the middle of a pandemic, and the landscape was different. I mean, I think it would have been challenging because, like, frankly, since, the summer of 2017, this has been a rebuild. So again, I'm going to anchor it back to, we've had kids for 15 years in inequitable middle grades, and, at a minimum, we need to fix that. And there are complementary things that are related to that also need to happen at the same time. But I don't see from the Willamette River to the easternmost boundary of that happening at the same time we're trying to, and frankly, we have a lot of students who have left the district or who aren't actively engaged, and we need to re-engage them and get them, back surrounded by their teachers and their classmates and back on track.
Appreciate it. Director Constam, you have your hands up. And then I actually do want to start transitioning us over to the policy conversation. I think what I'm hearing is that general consensus, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that the urgent need is to convert Harrison Park, and then the boundary work can really, let's think about where that lands in terms of a sequence. Understanding that when we do Harrison K8 conversion, there might be some, hanging chads that we have to address. Is that what I heard, Director Brim Edwards?
Yeah, well, I don't want to call a school community a hanging chad, because some of those schools have been waiting, a long time and been under enrolled, or they've had, Vestal with programs coming in and out, and Bridger. So yes, but with I would say that these have been impacted communities as we've moved, in an unprecedented way in outer Southeast into the K8 model, and then back again, and then all the focus programs moving around.
Got it. Director Constam?
Yeah, I just wanted to respond directly to Deputy Superintendent Hertz, because I think what you raised, Claire, is a bit of an elephant in the room, and that we haven't specifically talked about consolidation. And I appreciate you bringing that up so directly to try to get some feedback from us. I think it is apparent that is likely going to need to take place in order to create the right sized schools that we need, that as a byproduct of this reconfiguration. I think that back to the question of enrollment imbalances all across our district. I mean, when you talk about going from the Willamette River east, to the extent that we have school communities that have relatively right-sized enrollment now, we should leave well enough alone. But to the extent that we have adjacent communities that already have issues that need to be solved, we should use this process to take care of that. So I think we should be judicious about it. But we know that we have some schools that are significantly under or significantly over that maybe aren't directly implicated by, constituting the school community for Harrison Park and right sizing the elementaries that have fed into Harrison Park and Kellogg, but that it wouldn't make sense for us to leave those out of this process. So I just wanted to say that I heard you speaking specifically about consolidation. It's something that school boards often don't have the appetite for because it's never fun. It's always painful to lose your neighborhood school because we all feel so strongly and passionately about it. But, you're right. It's on the table. And I think we need to be explicit about that.
So before we move on to the next item, I want to anchor us back to our desired outcome of this session. To the PPS Board of Education will identify the critical issues it believes are the most important to address in the next 12 months. And what I heard is, again, a desire for the board to focus on the middle school conversions. Period. Am I pausing? And addressing the impacting what Director Brim Edwards said, impacting the other communities that are impacted by that decision. Is that fair consensus here?
I didn't understand what you said, Jonathan. Are you talking about doing the middle schools and then their feeder elementaries boundary shifts? Is that?
So I'm hearing the boundary would require river to east side boundary. Director or Claire, can you?
So there are quite a few under-enrolled K-5s on the east side of the district. And so we can work with a smaller set of communities. It's just it's questionable if there's enough students to make them right size. That's the concern. Well, I'm hearing what I needed to hear. So I appreciate what I've heard so far. Thank you.
So I'm thinking we're talking about like Harrison Park and the communities that feed into Harrison Park, looking at the boundaries for Creston and some of the people that feed into Kellogg. And, that's what I'm understanding when I hear us talk about middle school and feeder elementaries is the boundaries for those specific schools. But I'm hearing, Claire, that sort of starts a cascade of crazy. And I don't think we want to get into the level of complexity of that river to east side. But what I would prioritize is those middle schools and those feeders into them as much as we can, knowing that, again, as Director Scott has said multiple times, this is an incredibly complex issue with lots of variables, and we will find places where the guiding coalition might need to come back to the board and say, we're looking at consolidating this school. Is that something you have an appetite for? Or, this is something we're thinking about in this work you've charged us with. How are you responding to that?
So I'm going to call the question on this, because what that means is that if you look at the demographics, the west side of Southeast, which is much more prosperous and relatively less diverse with some exceptions, has pretty robust enrollment, verging above 100% at some schools. We're gonna not touch those, and instead, in the outer Southeast, where generally demographics are more diverse and lower income, and we're going to create a bunch of schools that are half filled on the order of, and Director Brin, remember it's referred to Martin Luther King Jr. School earlier, with the same kind of half-filled capacity, the same kind of issues that we've heard from the King community for years. We're going to be okay with doing that, because that's what we're saying. We're leaving, or we're going to close a school again in a lower income neighborhood. That's how we're going to balance enrollment. Talk to me about using the equity lens.
Director Bailey, I really appreciate that. I've been sitting here listening to everybody really carefully, partially because I talked to someone that from a different cultural community that said they don't speak unless they've heard all sides. And so I've been listening really carefully. I've been wondering about the root causes for these under-enrollments and over-enrollments. And I think we need to address root causes. There's a reason why people don't send their kids to the neighborhood school. And I'm also, King is my neighborhood elementary. And I've been involved with that school for a very long time. My grandmother retired from there, as did my mother. And I'm also very concerned about how we're talking about racial equity and how we're planning on implementing it. And this is a perfect example of, and actually the Southeast Guiding Coalition, I've just reread their letter asking for that coalition, the Guiding Coalition, to be increased. They know that, with the group that they have, they could make better decisions if they have more members and more diverse members. I'm really concerned about putting the burden on people of lower income and of darker skinned people, and putting the burden of rebalancing on those communities. I'm very concerned about that. I'd like to see a completely different outcome. I would like to elevate those voices. I'd like to elevate those kids that need us as adults to prioritize them in their educations. Those are the kids that we need to worry about. Low income, kids of color, English language learners. I'd like to see us as a group of adults prioritize those children and their families.
I think the question for me, Director DePass, is kind of going back to some of what Director Brim Edwards said around our priority as a district in the next 12 months really is on reopening and on welcoming our students back to the classroom well, and especially our students, our Black and Native students who we know have struggled during the pandemic and who we were failing, we had an opportunity gap before. And so for me, the question is, we do need to open Harrison Park as part of our long-term plan. So what do we ask the district to additionally take on in the next 12 months? And I think we need to have a conversation about the root causes of under-enrollment, and we need to look at the wealthier western southeast neighborhoods and rebalance all of that. My question is, what can we do well in the next 12 months? And maybe it does need to be a river to east side total rebalancing of elementary schools. But that's I'm trying to sit in the tension of what's the next right step for our district to take, since we can't do all the things. So what do you think?
Yeah. Well,
the
reopening, so we are asked to kind of rank or talk about our top 3 focus areas. And one of those top 3, reopening, isn't on that list. We're talking about whether, to prioritize middle school enrollment, the boundary, the co-location of neighborhood DLI programs, opening, of course, that's an important conversation, but that's not on our agenda tonight. We were asked to pick our top 3, identify these 3 identified, and what do we work on. I like what Director Scott said about, I think you said, Director Scott, you said we need to figure out what we can do well in the next 12 months, and then what do we phase? And I think that these 5, bulleted point, identified focus areas fit that bill. We're not going to be able to do all 5 of these well. And what is it should be, what is the top priority, I guess.
So I want to invite the board to the next section of the agenda, which is actually a potential good segue here, board policy. I have an understanding that there are some revisions to the board policy that were maybe spoken about. I wasn't at the board policy committee, but maybe we could start there. So the next item, really our outcome, is to identify the policies that requires clarification. so that PPS school district staff and by extension, the Southeast Guiding Coalition can effectively and clearly complete phase 2 of its work. And so we attached links to the policies and our guiding questions for this topic. Which of the school board policies are relevant in providing clarity and guidance to staff in the Southeast Guiding Coalition in phase 2? Again, do our school board policy that's currently articulated provide clear direction about our priorities and parameters to the staff, the coalition, and school communities who will contribute to constructing a recommendation in phase 2? And the last question is, if our school board policies as currently articulated are not sufficiently clear, then what are our next steps to bring clarity to these policies?
So I'm just say, because I've been in the policy committee since it was formed in 2017, and this issue has been sitting in committee for about 2 years. And I think it's a misnomer to call it clarity, because it's actually just it's a changing of the rules. I mean, so that's not really clarity. It's just, there's some changes are being proposed that would, if you were going to, one way to describe it is it could make enrollment balancing easier. But it is a change in policy, and frankly, I think it's unfair to, in the middle of a process that we're getting ready to change things, to say, oh, and by the way, we're also at the same time going to now change the rules for your community. And I'll speak as a parent of more than one child. Like getting rid of the sibling co-enrollment, I think makes things super challenging, and it makes things super challenging, not necessarily for families that have, two parents with a lot of flexibility in their professional jobs to be able to pick up, drop off, do, after school activities, go to school conferences. So, I don't think, I think that changing those policies will have a huge impact on families. And I just don't think it's fair to be like, oh, we need to, I mean, we should have done this. We didn't, a year ago before the process started, but now we're mid-process and it's like, oh, and now we're going to change the rules. And I don't see how we change our policy, say we have a legitimate and authentic community engagement around the policy change like we're required to do, and then change the policy, and then so that we can have it apply to, out to Southeast, frankly. And there was a suggestion the other day that maybe there'd be sort of a set of rules or a set of temporary rules for this piece, and then longer term, we'd make these other changes. And to me, that strikes me as fundamentally unfair as well, that we're going to have different sets of rules, because, I think, what's good for students and families in, Southeast, Northeast, West Portland, I don't think it's that different. And I don't think it's fair to change the rules in the middle of, right before we're getting ready to impact students, and in the middle of a pandemic.
I think that, my understanding, Director Brim Edwards, is if we change the rules, then those apply to everybody going forward. So if we end sibling to the same school, that applies to everybody going forward. If we say, once you age out of your zone, your school, you need to go to the school in your zone, that would apply to everyone, that we would end some of those legacy things for everyone. And if other arrangements were made in the past with the grant community or other communities, I think we do need to have an equitable, these are for everyone going forward. Because I've heard this from you multiple times, this concern that Southeast is sort of a place where rules get made that other people in other areas kind of have negotiated out of. So I'm not okay with us passing rules that don't kind of apply to everyone. And then the second piece for me is, what the reason we're talking about changing these is because what we have seen through the data is that the legacies and the sibling thing mean that when we're trying to balance enrollment, it's such a lag, right? Because, I have a friend whose oldest child and her youngest child are like 15 years apart. Maybe it's not that many. Maybe it is. So, but if they had moved, the youngest daughter would have still be able to be in that school based on, the middle child, because they have a middle child. And so, if we have the sibling piece and that middle child was still going to school. So it's, some of that is part of the problem. And I know that those aren't most of the cases that we're talking about, but I know we saw it at Llewellyn, lived experience, when the boundary change happened, that some kids went to Dunaway. It took a long time to show up in the school as far as overcrowding because of those legacy and sibling things. And it's hard because my kid was friends with all those kids and we're glad they were at our school on an individual level, but I saw the impact it had on the building and how hard that was. So I do think we need to be talking about it. We have the data to show that the sibling thing and the legacy do impact our boundary work. So we need to be really clear about knowing that and saying, what is it these policies are for? Like, what is the intent? Look at them through a racial equity lens and then try to make them better. And knowing what the data is around the impact on enrollment and balancing.
Can I ask a quick question?
Dr. Scott?
I just want to make sure, is this a conversation that's been happening in the policy committee, or did I miss something along the way?
For 2.5 years, but it's still sitting in committee.
Okay. The only reason I bring it up is I'm feeling a little, I actually have no idea what you all are talking about. And so I just, if I missed something, let me know, right? If there's an email that I missed or a briefing that I missed, but it feels like we're having a very insider conversation about something that, at least for me, has not been surfaced yet as something that's coming forward.
And I also don't attend those meetings, so I'm trying to follow along.
So I think, to be fair, it was brought up 2 years ago. I don't know exactly when. I wasn't on the committee then, and it's.
I wasn't on the board, so that's okay.
Yeah, and it's reemerged just in the last couple of weeks. So there was some preliminary drafting work done. It got set aside because of other priorities, and now it's back. So I'll give an example of one piece of it. The current policy says if there's a boundary change, students can continue going to their current school to the highest grade. They have that option as opposed to shifting to the new school at say 3rd grade. Now, we suspended that policy when we were making changes around Beverly Cleary because of overcrowding for a number of grades. They were just moved with a new boundary. But that's what's on the books for policy. And I think in looking at the policy, if pretend, 20 years from now, and we actually get to a relatively good balance in terms of enrollment. Sorry, that was a little sarcasm. When we get to that place where we're relatively balanced, then I think there's a lot of the current policy that makes perfect sense. We want to have a minimal impact on families when we change boundaries. Ideally, it would be, okay, we're going to adjust a boundary because this school enrollment is going up. They're starting to look at overcrowding. Adjacent schools, not so much. So we can do a boundary shift, and it'll start with next year's kindergarten. So no current student would be impacted. And we can get into the sibling question in a minute, but that's one piece, a big piece of the current policy and Director Lowry referred to it as, that's a 6-year wait. That's a long phase in if you're overcrowded or under enrolled. So the same would be true, for example, of, we've talked about Martin Luther King Jr. School earlier. They're at, I don't know, I can't remember, 50% capacity roughly. It would be a long 6-year wait before they would be at, some kind of optimal enrollment if we change the boundaries tomorrow. And we just have a number of schools in that situation. And so if we stick to current policy, it's going to be a long time coming before we get to a balance. So that's one of the issue, and that's why I would suggest that it's one thing to look at the long-term policy, and quite another to say we are so far out of whack now in so many situations. What do we need to? What kind of rules do we need to operate on in the short term that we can hopefully just do in the short term and then get to a much, shall I say, kinder, gentler long-term policy. But we're again, we're going to look at next year having really low enrollment at Arleta, Lent, Creston, Marysville. We're going to look at Lane once Access moves out, being under-enrolled. Whitman is under-enrolled. A lot of schools there. And if we don't address that, there you go. I think there's going to be some inequities in services provided to those schools based on how we do, and our staffing by enrollment. That either it costs us money and we add staff there, or do we address it through enrollment balancing? So that's one piece of the policy. That the add-on to it is the sibling clause, which says, so in the case of Director Lowry talked about Llewellyn and Dunaway, a student could, let's see, Llewellyn was overcrowded, and so a student could stay at Llewellyn until the 5th grade. But if they had a sibling that entered that school before they left, that sibling could also stay at Llewellyn, again, delaying the adjustment. Do we want to keep that or not? And again, in the short term and in the long term, that's a question I would raise. And clearly there are multiple sides to that question. But it's something that we haven't looked at this policy in quite a while. We should take a look. And in particular, I don't think we've really applied the equity lens in looking at these policies.
I also
Director Bailey,
you can have kids on the same Little League team and in the same school, and life is beautiful. And then all of a sudden one goes to another school or goes to a different Little League team, and it ruins your life. But guess what? You get over it. You just, as a parent, you have to adjust to these things. This is like the idea about being a parent, is you're adjusting to new data coming in and new requirements and things you have to do differently than before. And you just buck up and do them differently than before. I feel like, if I was the running things, I would want to see that the policy is set first. You set that with a racial equity lens. You do that so the most marginalized folks aren't impacted, and then you make your decisions once those policies in place. The moving target thing is very Portland. It's like everybody wins, but at some point I feel like we need to, we still have people moving to Portland. Our population is still increasing, and I feel like you develop the policy first and set that, and then you have a North Star by which to make those difficult decisions about boundaries.
Well, I'm not going to disagree with you. What's happened is we haven't, you can look in our policy and see that we've been, there's supposed to be an annual report on where we are with enrollment and where there are crises. There's supposed to be a number of reports if you look at this, the student transfer policy, that we as a district have not acted on. And so it's sort of like why are we having a forest fire? Well, if you haven't cleared out the undergrowth for 50 years, once you get a spark, then it's a big fire. We haven't taken the steps of having that ongoing regular process to adjust enrollment. So now we've got these big imbalances that, again, if we want to address them slowly and phase them in over 6 years, then let's call that, but let's call it what it is.
So Director Bailey, what I'm hearing a conversation about a couple things. One is there was a lot of conversation around policy 4.10.045, student assignment to neighborhood schools. It seems like there needs to be some clarity, I think I agree with Director Britton Edwards. There needs to be a look at this policy. And what I'm hearing from a number of you is this desire to really look at this policy through a racial equity and social justice lens. And so are there, as we think about the other policies, are there others that come to mind as needing to be addressed, again, in the next 12 months?
Jonathan,
Director Consta?
This is not regarding other policies, but I just wanted to jump in and say there's also an execution and administration piece of this, as we saw with Creston, where we haven't had fidelity to a lot of our policies, and particularly around, moving on to the, like from grade school to middle school or a high school assignment. So we need to be really clear that we are equally applying our policies as written, because that has a big influence on where our population ends up settling.
I agree, and that's a great point, Director Constam, and I'm glad you brought that up during our decision making on Creston. That is, that policy on the books, though, again, we haven't looked at that through an equity lens. We might end up in the same place, but I think it's worth talking about, and particularly that decision, we ended up, the majority of students that were impacted by that decision were students of color and lower income students. So again, we at least need to look at that clearly and decide whether that's the way we want to continue going forward.
Jonathan, do you mind if I ask a question?
Please, Danny.
In just trying to understand sort of how to support the board, I'm hearing a lot of folks wanting to sort of like look at the policy through an equity lens, and I'm wondering, is it that you want to look at the policy through an equity lens, or that you also want to look at sort of actual data? So I think what I'm hearing is that maybe there are some indicators, either demographic or student indicators, that you're wanting to look at in relationship to the policy, or is it that you want to kind of have more time as a collective to be able to go through the questions and really sort of get real about sort of like what are assumptions going in, what are outlining barriers that are within the policy, or maybe it's both.
I would really love us in the policy committee to look at this policy going through the racial equity lens questions, and really, I know we've done it once already with this policy, but I'd love for us to do it again. And then I think we have a lot of narrative around the legacy policy and the student sibling policy, but I would love for us to have some data around, I know it's really hard, Judy, we talked about this before, that we don't always have that information, but maybe we can collect some, because I think we don't want to make a decision that negatively impacts Black and Native students. And so I think we want some information about who's using this policy, how's it being used, so that we don't do something that we think is right with some unintended harmful impacts. That's what I would like, at least.
Can I quibble a bit with a few things that Director Bailey said?
Please go ahead.
Mostly around the idea that we haven't talked about this policies, or in fact the whole suite of policies around enrollment stuff. I would beg to differ. We've been talking about this as a district since at least 2008. And there's a reason why these policies have not changed, because any change is going to require that the district and the board make some difficult decisions that are going inevitably to make some school communities unhappy, potentially every school community unhappy. There's a reason why we have not done this for decades. And I, for one, am sick of talking about these things if we're not actually going to do anything about them. If we are not willing to make the difficult decisions and stand by them, then let's just say that out loud and stop pretending and come up with some other way to respond to inevitable inequities that are going to be present in schools that have vastly different enrollment profiles. And I'm just talking about, sheer numbers. I would love to be able to tackle some of these things. I think this has bedeviled the district for at least 20 years. But I am sufficiently cynical at this point that I'm tired of having this conversation over and over and over again if we are not going to be willing to do the hard work. And can I just point out, while it's true that we have not explicitly looked at these policies to the extent we need to in terms of the current racial equity, social justice lens, I will remind you all that the district has had a racial educational equity policy in place since 2011. And every discussion that I have participated in, and there have been legion, every single time we have talked about all of these policies, we have in fact talked about it in terms of racial equity. And then we don't follow through.
So, Director Moore, we are at 7:55, 7:56, 7:57. Things feels like my minutes are changing on me. So I think what I'm hearing from this conversation is that there is a general consensus, or maybe not consensus. There's a general desire to look at the policies. There was a conversation around what it looks like to commit to a racial equity lens of these policies. So I do want to take a break. So take a 10-minute break. And so one of the things that Chair Lowry and Chair Moore as the policy committee chair, how would you two, and Director Bailey as the vice chair, how would you three collectively, do you want to, so one of the things that I have a question about, I guess, is like, timeline and commitment and what does that look like? And so I think there is I also heard, that not all of our board members have a deep understanding of or understanding of our policies. And so how do we even begin to peel that layer? So I just kind of want to raise those issues and maybe give Director Moore and Director Lowry a say before we go to a break.
I mean,
Not
we
to
have our
put you on the spot.
Where is the enrollment balancing stuff on our calendar, Rita? Has it completely dropped off at this point?
No, not at all. We're just about to ramp it up again.
Yeah, so I think, we have it scheduled to come up, correct? So policy committee has a calendar with all of the policies, when they'll come forward, when we hope they'll be ready for a first reading. And these are on there. I don't have the calendar to hand.
So we had, I don't either. I can tell you that we had so we started to look at these policies, the suite of policies last year. We were really kind of just getting going when COVID hit and we ended up tabling. We just started to kind of restart the conversation. At the last committee meeting, we were, the topic at hand was the student enrollment and the student assignment to neighborhood schools policy. And Director Bailey and I offered some kind of framing questions for the discussion. So we didn't get into details. I don't know, does that help?
So I'm gonna butt in. I just want to reiterate, I think changing the policy to get to either reaffirm what's on the books or make some changes, I think we can take time to do that. I think what's needed in the short term with the current imbalances that we have and the size of them is to decide, and I think it's and if the board as a whole wants a subcommittee of us to work on that, to come up with some proposed short-term operating rules, or we're going to suspend this policy as we go through the Southeast process and the North and Northeast process. And here's why.
So I'm just going to speak up because we have a committee, and I don't think we need another subcommittee. We have a committee. It's been sitting there. And I am going to really object to a set of short-term rules that apply to one quadrant, and then everybody else gets a full policy process to weigh in.
Julia, did you listen to what I said?
I did. You said a set of rules for the short term, and then the longer term policy discussion.
Okay,
so,
but I did not say one. I did not say one quadrant. That's your term. You've been using it incorrectly, specifically to what I've said several times now.
So, but aren't we talking about the Southeast Guiding Coalition? I mean, I'm confused then, because I thought this discussion was primarily about what sort of direction we're giving the Southeast Guiding Coalition. And so if I'm wrong, if this is the entire district, we're giving direction and we're going to open it up to other things, that's different. But I'm sorry, because that's what I very clearly thought this meeting was about, phase 2.
Yeah, I just would appreciate it if you would acknowledge I also said North and Northeast. If you could just acknowledge that, then fine, we can move along. No harm, no foul.
I'd like to see what that looks like, because I don't see, if that's the case, then that's a bigger conversation that we're doing stuff in North and Northeast as well. What are we doing in North and Northeast? Sorry, maybe this is a side discussion, but I thought this was the Southeast Guiding Coalition.
So I think what I'm hearing, I think in order for us to move forward there was a conversation around needing to revise these policies. Some of these policies currently sit in the policy committee of the Board of Ed. Dr. Moore is saying that there is going to be an opportunity for us for the board to look at those policies. But do we have a timeline on that, Dr. Moore?
Imminently. I would like if we're going to look at these policies and make some meaningful changes, I need to have I personally, I'm just going to speak for myself. I need to have some faith that that we're actually going to make some meaningful changes to these policies that would create a system, some systemic processes that would allow the district to have a regular mechanism to respond to enrollment fluctuations over time. And I think, I mean, to speak to Julia's point, when Scott and I talk about short-term versus long-term, the reality is that you know, I gave you some numbers. 61% of our schools have some substantial level of mismatch between building capacity and current enrollment. That did not happen overnight. That's an accretion of changes that have happened over 20 years or more, precisely because the district does not have a mechanism to respond in any kind of timely fashion to population shifts across the district. So it seems to me that we can have a policy framework that would allow that to happen. The reality, though, is that right now we have dramatic enrollment issues across the district. If we want to make any immediate or even foreseeable changes in those enrollment issues, then we're probably not going to be able to use the kind of, you know, long-term, systemic, gradual, incremental mechanism that I at least envision would be helpful longer term for the district. So that's, I mean, that's the difference between long-term and short-term. We're not talking about, you know, targeting Southeast for some special treatment. If we end up having the will and the courage to make some significant changes in the enrollment situation across the district, then it would have to apply to, at minimum, the entire East Side, as Claire Hertz mentioned earlier.
Great. Well, thank you. With that, I think we're going to take a 10-minute break. Stretch, relax. I think we're going to go off live, and we'll be back in. That break. I needed it to stretch my legs. So we're going to move on to the next agenda item of our conversation, which is to talk about prioritization around focus areas here for the district. I'm going to invite staff to participate, senior leadership to participate in the conversation. But before I'm actually going to turn it over to the superintendent to walk us through the top focus areas for PPS here in the next 12 months, share a little bit about that. But before I do that, Deputy Superintendent Hertz, we just came back from a break where we had two big conversations about prioritization regarding enrollment and program balancing, both from a policy standpoint and from a directional standpoint. Did you get what you needed? Have you begun to get what you needed? Do you need any clarifications before we move forward?
So I don't need clarifications, but I've heard a narrowing of some of the focus, which is helpful, especially with staff capacity. And then I've also heard that the policy is continuing. And so the question I have, of course, in my mind is, with the policy continuing, might we delay the Southeast Guiding Coalition until that policy work is done? And so that's a question on my mind, doesn't have to be answered now, but certainly the next conversation about prioritization of our focus areas over the next 12 months will be helpful in guiding that response as well.
So I'm sorry, I feel like I'm not being heard. So at least go ahead and acknowledge me and then disagree with me, that's fine. But the long-term policy work is different, in my opinion, from what we need right now in the next several years or however long it's going to take of how we rebalance. And again, I'm fine with people disagreeing with that, but I'm saying going to the policy committee and saying we need to work through the long-term policy before Southeast can go forward, in my view, is incorrect, because I don't think those long-term policies are what we need in the short term. I'll just stop there. Thank you for listening, and let's proceed.
Well, maybe Scott, and I do want to understand, because I'm not understanding, because are you saying like we have, if it's our policy isn't, are you saying we just like suspend the policy? Or I'm not quite sure what a short-term policy is, because like the policy is the policy, and I don't know other ways to do things. I mean, like,
yeah,
how you get a short-term policy versus a long-term policy.
Just like we suspended some of these policies when we were dealing with Beverly Cleary overcrowding, where we said, no, you don't get to attend your school to the highest grade. You're overcrowded. We're going to move you now. So we need to consider things like that. Otherwise, we're going to have substantially under-enrolled schools for a long time. So that's yes. So I'm talking about a suspension of current policy in the short term as we go through this whole rebalancing process that we've talked about for Southeast, North, and Northeast.
Thank you for clarifying.
Okay, is that good? Okay,
Thank
great.
you.
Thanks.
I don't agree with you, but thank you for, I do understand now. That
Jonathan.
Director Bailey, and I go ahead. Before Director Scott, I guess there was one clarification where, so understanding that clarification, Director Bailey, is that conversation, where does that conversation take place? In Pulse, I'm just really curious. Is that a policy conversation, policy committee?
So here's where I think we are. I think this is a good conversation we're having tonight in terms of, what are the priorities, where are we going forward? And there's a number of very specific instructions that the Southeast Guiding Coalition has asked us for that we will need to do as a board and or as staff, depending on the particular topic, that we need to do before they can really dig into their work. I mean, they can do some orientation stuff, but we need to make some decisions collectively before then. And so I don't think it's a policy committee per se. I think what we need to do in the short term in terms of the rules of engagement is really very specific to, and I think the issues in Southeast are going to come up in North and Northeast as well. It's going to be the same kind of issues as we reconfigure, as we rebalance. We need to look at the particulars and have that inform us of how we're going to proceed. Because if nothing else, if they make some boundary proposals and Flo runs the numbers, Flo being our consultant with that has the big database, we need to be clear on what the rules are. Because if it's you stay in your current school till the highest grade, or if it's we're going to move you now, that makes a difference in enrollment and how the boundaries get drawn and so on. So again, I don't think it's a policy.
So it's
I don't think it's policy committee. I think it's it can be a subset of us if it's a task force, or it can be the group as a whole. But we're going to have another one of these where we make some very serious decisions going forward about how we deal with boundary changes and what we're going to do with creative science. I mean, that's
Director Scott, you had a
big issue hanging out there.
Yeah, I know you're trying to move us on, so I'll more just put this out as a question for later. I hear the sort of the statements around narrowing, and I agree with that. I think the focus on staff capacity and community capacity that Director Brim-Edwards brought up are really valuable and something we need to really focus on. What I guess I don't want to lose sight of though is when I heard this sort of, in order to do balancing right, we need to do it from the river, to the outer boundary. I didn't take that as a oh, we'll never be able to do that. I took as maybe this year's not the year we do it, but I think that's exactly the work we should be doing. So I didn't hear from my colleagues whether they agree with that, whether this was sort of a put it off to never do it or just put it off until there's a little bit more capacity. But for me, that's exactly how you address boundary changes through an equity lens. Is you look at the entire thing, you make the adjustments that are needed to sort of bring that. And also beginning a process of how do we start doing this every 10 years, right? Or even every 5 years? Because in-migration within the city is very, very rapid. And I will just make a random analogy. The urban growth boundary is on a regular schedule because we know that changes happen all the time. And so we always have to come back and be looking, are we looking ahead 5 or 10 years? Do we have enough land? And I think part of the problem with PPS is since we're not on a regular schedule, it feels abnormal, but this is the normal work of a school board. And every set period of time, whether it's 5 or 10 years, we need to be redrawing some boundaries because people are going to move, but schools don't. We all know that. So I don't want to shy away from the big stuff, although I think the point about our short-term capacity and medium-term capacity is really important.
Appreciate that. So Superintendent Guerrero, do you want to give us a quick overview of the resource that's in this agenda item? So again, for this topic, board, our desired outcome is for the board and PPS senior leadership to clarify what it believes to be the most important focus areas in the next 12 months, in the next year. So Superintendent Guerrero.
Good evening, directors. It was tough to just stand back and really just listen, but I think that's part of the exercise here. Is I appreciate directors making the time tonight to really dive into this important set of related topics because it's complex. And I haven't heard directors disagree about the list of goals that talk about K-8 reconfiguration or addressing school boundaries, or how do we feel about co-locations and language pathways? How do we feel about a continuum of SPED programming that we should be offering? How important it is to rebalance high schools? All of those are laudable goals. And so I have a debate around, do you prioritize? Do you get to all of them over time? Do some trump others at certain periods? I think that it's an important conversation. But what I'm hearing is we want to be that more equitable school system. You shared stories about your own experiences with school transition. Some of you have heard me give a keynote remark around all of my transitions, and those weren't exactly positive for me. And so, going into this next phase of work with eyes wide open, and I think some consensus agreement in fairness to not just staff, but really the Southeast Guiding Coalition, who I think has posed some thoughtful questions. They've been immersed in it, and I think legitimately they're raising, here's some guidance or range of flexibility we may have available that it would be helpful to sort of have clarity around so we can proceed with a next body of work. And how wide and how narrow that body of work is in this next phase. I guess my point in this next section is this work requires a lot of dedicated time and effort, not just by staff, not just by community representatives, but board members too, in the midst of the context that we find ourselves in. And we have quite a list of equally important priorities that we have to balance our capacity with. So in this next part of the agenda, and I don't think we have to take a lot of time on this, but to acknowledge there's some other key focus areas that preoccupy oftentimes the same set of people. And for me, and I know for my colleagues, the number one thing we're consumed by right now is getting our students back to school and sort of giving them the meaningful continuity of learning that we know that we're anxious to provide, and doing that in a healthy, safe way that meets guidelines, that protects our employees and everyone else who's on campus. So, and that's a source of a lot of back and forth conversation right now, and a lot of creative thinking about how we do that, and how do we do that thoughtfully in consultation with experts who can guide those conversations. So I'd say that should be the preeminent priority for all of us right now. And we'll get another update tomorrow night. And so you've seen since last March, We've had to sort of really change up our service delivery to one that's distance learning. We saw the metrics scarily really peak and go up and really impact the community, and they still are. We have begun each week to add in limited in-person opportunities for some of our more impacted students with volunteer teachers. And we're in the midst of working through plans for elementary, middle, and high school hybrid plans with our labor partners, which requires a lot of careful negotiation to make sure everyone's concerns are addressed there. So there's the getting back to in-person school that is preoccupying staff capacity. Simultaneously, the business of the district is action. We set out to engage in in the development of a multi-year roadmap, a strategic plan for this district that is supposed to serve as the accompaniment to the vision. We spent a year on the vision. We heard from the community. We have a beautiful product, but it's only a glossy document if you don't actually have a blueprint for how you're going to make it true. And so our goal has been to create those operational steps required so that over time, you see more and more of those elements be observable. And so staff was making some headway there, then the pandemic hit. And so we've fallen a few months behind in that work, but we've actually continued coming together to continue sort of articulating what hopefully will be a draft strategic plan that we can begin to sort of present and wrestle and speak to you about. So that work is going on. And even as emerging themes of that multi-year strategic plan emerge, we've been trying to keep those in mind as we develop a budget for the coming school year. So some of what I'm going to talk about shouldn't be a surprise to you, is a preview of the priorities you're going to hear that there's a focus on with our budget proposal, because we know when we get to a good place with this, a multi-year strategic plan will drive resource management and allocation. And it's been a bit upside down for a number of years, where the budget is actually sort of driving the work. So this body of work around strategic planning and resource alignment is also another sort of heavy task that, again, a lot of the same senior staff are engaged in right now. We have a budget calendar we're trying to observe. We've tried to brief board members a little bit along the way as some things become clear. And we have a CBRC and other mechanisms that we want to sort of respectfully observe. But our goal is to bring forth a budget proposal that in it embeds some of the things you'll see eventually in the strategic plan. And we want to be able to, and we look forward to all of that conversation. Now, strategic planning just isn't around those elements of our vision. There'll be some prioritized system shifts, some work that focus groups of teachers have identified in our educator elements, focus groups of students who have talked about what the graduate portrait should look like when you backward map it to middle school, to early ed, and there's some exciting that's happening there. We're looking forward to sharing with you. There's also some other long-range planning. There's long-range facilities planning. And from here, we're grateful for the school modernization bond once again being passed at the rate that it was. The 2020 school modernization bond, that's another heavy lift. And it's not just a facilities exercise to say, well, the folks down on L1 in the building can take care of that. We'll focus on the rest. We know that this bond package has instructional implications, primarily the curriculum adoptions, which our team is super excited about finally, after decades, to really bring teachers together to identify what are those high quality instructional materials that our students need access to. And there's a process we have to observe there, and we have to be very sort of sequential and methodical about how we make those decisions for some pretty major investments. So there's the 2020 school bond. I'll go back up on the agenda. There's middle school redesign. All of this conversation about reconfiguring our K-8s is with the goal of getting them into comprehensive middle schools. Well, unless you're doing something different with your middle schools, you're racing to get them back into sort of these traditional models. And we've done sort of a load of initial thinking. Some of you joined us in some district visits. We know that one of the first steps in really embarking on this middle school redesign work is to really do these empathy tours with our students. What is it in the middle grades experience that you would hope to be exposed to? And we know that it's going to not look like your typical 6-period traditional middle school. It'll probably be something a lot more interdisciplinary, something much more project-based, something that pays attention to youth development in middle school. What a great time to really do that during those awkward years when kids are trying to figure out their identity and what they want to stand for and what their interests might be. And what a great time to explore what the possibilities out there. So through exposure, through expanded elective wheels, or testing out pathways they may want to choose to pursue when they arrive at high school. But the notion being that they will leave the 8th grade with some kind of a capstone, which we've talked about before, and we have not forgotten this. We are still very much on that track to be able to reflect on how far they've come as an individual. The graduate portrait talks about certain skills and dispositions. Well, by the 8th grade, they should be somewhere along the continuum with each of those skills and dispositions. And how wonderful for a student to have the sense of self-reflection and agency to say, here's where I am in being that kind of a global steward that the graduate portrait comes from, or here are some of the empathy skills that I think I'm demonstrating or that I want to work on. It's that kind of more authentic assessment that we've talked about on many board nights. That isn't just driven by a high stakes test, but is actually something much more holistic. And so it's that middle school redesign work that we're excited to kick off in the next couple of days. I think you're going to be observing an announcement for a new middle school redesign director, which you won't be surprised to hear is one of our current school leaders who's excited to lead this work, alongside also we have a new Kellogg principal, and we have a cohort of middle school principals who have been meeting all year actually to begin to talk about some of the themes and strands of work that come with middle school redesign. The combination of some central staff capacity work, the cohort of comprehensive middle schools, as well as some technical assistance, and what our students in a student-centered process are going to lead the way in the way that we in Portland Public Schools design middle schools of the future, I think is exciting, because then we're reconfiguring schools for something new, innovative, that better meets the needs of our students. And we know that in designing those experiences, that's going to require a lot of educator input to think and do differently than the way we've played middle school in the past. So there's middle school redesign and the initial couple of phases that we'll be embarking on concurrently with everything else going on. And then I'll mention a third, and this isn't an exhaustive list. Our bond also had this element of a Center for Black Student Excellence. And if you want to talk about community engagement, I mean, this one in particular is really going to need to bring in all of our stakeholders when we talk about how, and this is, I think, a first of its kind thing in the country, if we get it right, how do you take an entire sort of nucleus of a city, a neighborhood, Albina in this case, and talk about all sectors, the educational institutions as a slice, the housing opportunities, the job opportunities, all aspects of thinking of that cradle to college continuum. How do we have some indicators about what success would look like if we had an actual children, youth, and families agenda for a part of town that hopefully we could scale over time across the city? But if we start in an underserved community that has a lot of brilliance and assets within it, and we start to focus an effort in a set of schools that has an opportunity to modernize and build that's best suited and revolves around the students that we serve there, what kind of a exciting counter narrative could be created? And so this notion of a Center for Black Student Excellence is, yes, it's going to require a lot of internal work, a lot of future conversations with directors that we look forward to, and primarily a lot of conversations with our community stakeholders, because this is their effort. And so when you look at strategic plan and budget development, 2020 school bond modernization, middle school redesign, Center for Black Student Excellence, and the day-to-day work of school and district improvement, and what our staff is out in schools now, even as we observe programming and limited in person. Staff, we want to be really clear about communicating what the priorities are. And if it's something else besides the ones I've just described, then it's going to be important to know what conscious trade-off we're making. But if these are the right sort of key initiatives for the immediate term, to what degree, how deep do we want to go in this enrollment balancing work that seems necessary in the next 6 months and the next 12 months. But I just wanted to lay in the context of a lot of the same staff also being tasked on these other very key initiatives that also are trying to provide opportunities for our students. So I think that's hopefully what you were looking for, Jonathan, is to just lay a little context here off the cuff, so that okay.
Absolutely, appreciate it, Superintendent Guerrero. So for this agenda item, what I'd love to do is actually have every board member kind of react to and reflect on what the superintendent just shared, and how does that sit within your own priorities and your own collective efforts moving forward. I'd love to go around and hear from every single one. And then we'll transition over to the next item, which is around community engagement, which I know we're really excited to talk about. And then I do want to note that I'm going to try to really get us out at the door 9:15, maybe 9:20, knowing that we all have a board meeting tomorrow that's probably going to go longer than 3 hours. And so I want to be just conscious of everybody else's, all of our time. So with that, who would like to kick us off in this agenda item?
Well, I feel like I've spoken a lot, but in the interest of time, I'll kick it off. I really appreciate this tremendously, and I think it loops back to, again, what Director Brim-Edwards said earlier about what should be our main focus. And I actually almost feel like we should have let off with this because it is so encompassing of the work that's going on in the district. Yeah, I mean, my reaction is that this is exactly where our focus needs to be. And obviously in terms of reopening and getting our students back towards in-person school, absolutely important. And then that strategic planning and resource realignment, this is the urgent but I'm sorry, it's the important but less urgent work that often goes by the wayside. And so by focusing on it and making sure it's happening, I think it's really important. And then yeah, I think the key strategic initiatives around middle school redesign and getting that Center for Black Student Excellence could be so transformative for our students and our entire district, for all of our students in the district. And then obviously the public trust that comes with the school bond. So everything here I'm in agreement with. And for me, it gets back to highlight that issue of how do we stage these things moving forward. Boundary issues are really important. And there are some things that have to be done. And I've appreciated, hearing we have to do Harrison Park, and a couple other things, but I think having a really, a genuine conversation. We set the boundary coalition work, not just for Southeast, but for the district before the pandemic. So it doesn't have to continue on the same timeline. And I think we have been sort of going down that road, but we don't have to. And I am very open, not to taking it off the table. As I said just a few minutes ago, I think we need to plan it out, but it doesn't have to be this year. It doesn't have to be in what year are we in? 2021. It could be in 2022 or 2023. And I think that recognizing where people are, not just in terms of staff capacity, but also just mental capacity, right? And 2020 was a traumatic year, and there are a lot of people hitting walls, and whether they're community members or staff members or board members, I think it's worth taking all that into account. So this is hugely important, and I put this more important than the boundary work we're talking about, with the exception of some of the things that are mandatory we have to get done.
Thank you, Director. Who would like to go next?
I'll go next. This is Director DePass. As I looked over these three things, I thought, which two would I prioritize? Which one would drop off my plate? I thought it was interesting that under bullet point 3, the key strategic initiatives, that the middle school redesign and the Center for Black Excellence are kind of in that same bucket. I do know of some instances where either public organizations, in some cases nonprofits, have taken strategic planning off the table in lieu of just continuing on with the work, lessening the staff requirements of staff time. The city of Portland, for instance, has been very, has a lot of parents that are juggling CDL and their jobs. And so we've, put some temporary policies in place that lessens the burden on staff. I think that that's really important right now. I think Director Scott said people are hitting walls, and that's true. If it were me, I would prioritize number 1, and that's the path toward in-person learning. I think is really important, and appreciate the work that's already gone into that. And then the key strategic initiatives, I think, are also important. The middle school redesign and the development of the Center for Black Student Excellence. Although I think I agree with Director Scott that the middle school redesign, I feel like that could happen. It could happen later. We've gotten through phase 1, and maybe we take a pause in between phase 1 and phase 2, wrap up what we've learned from phase 1, improve on the process, and pick it up in 12 months.
Thank you, Director DePass. Who would like to go next? Chair Lowry?
I would agree with what Andrew said about, I'm tired and apparently not able to focus. I agreed with what Andrew said, don't remember what it was at this point. So that's how my brain is working tonight. Okay. So I really think that, I am really deeply concerned about our capacity, what we are asking our staff to do. And I think all of it is super important. And I think, one of the really hard things of this place and time where we are is, I think we were on an amazing trajectory with fundamental organizational transformational change that was happening. And then the pandemic hit, and our staff has continued on that trajectory and dealt with, what does it mean to do pandemic life well and start to look to reopening. And so now we're trying to figure out, how do we get back to some semblance of normal? Like, I think shutting down an organization like ours is easier than restarting one slowly and safely. So that's my biggest concern is I really think, the piece about Harrison Park needs to happen, but I do agree with, I remember what I agreed with you about, Andrew, is I would like us to do River to just past 205, however far out we go, east, and plan to do that maybe in 2022. I don't want that work. I think Director DePass, you spoke to, who's not benefiting from these things and who continually, I think Director Brimedgers, you said, continually are the people who get the short end of the stick in the way the district does things. So I'd like us to have a long-term plan, but I'd like us to really focus on maybe just doing the Harrison Park piece this next year. And then when things get back to normal, whatever that looks like, we can do that broader work of really fundamentally looking at what does equity look like in our district. And I think, Andrew, your comment about we need to do this on a schedule every 5 years, every 10 years, whatever, and just have this adjustment. We are so fundamentally out of alignment. This is huge work, but this should be, going forward from this place of change, should be just minor adjustments. But we can't take on that huge, massive adjustment right in this moment with everything else our staff is being tasked with. So that's where I am.
Thank you, Chair.
I can weigh in because I don't think it's going to be that long. I started out this conversation with I think we have a lot on our plate. And I look at where we need to devote our focus. And I mean, every single school is going to require support from the central office, the full support from the staff that work there. So we're going to be tapped out. It's not just like, hey, this is something that's happening over in one part of the district. I think that's so clearly. I mean, that has to be the number one thing. And you know, I look at, and I don't know enough about the strategic planning process, whether there's some external facing piece to it or whether it's more of an internal. So if it's more of an internal, I think that's for staff to gauge the capacity on that. I will say, you know, for me, middle school redesign, and I consider that as sort of part and parcel of, I don't want there to be a, we can't wait to start the work because frankly, we opened two new middle schools 3 years ago, and we're still waiting for that vision to be infused, and the Center for Black Student Excellence. So I find little on here that I would substitute for a broader enrollment balancing effort. So to me, that's why I land on the, like, we absolutely have to do these things on that are the 3 focus areas. So to me, that tells me, how do we scope down or sequence out the enrollment balancing work? But Harrison Park has to happen. I'm not going to lose sight of that. I've been saying it for 4 years.
Can go. Superintendent, I really appreciate you putting these priorities out explicitly in this conversation to remind us what is the what of everything that we're working on right now. I agree that we should be as narrow in our focus with the second phase of this work as is practical. And when I say practical, I would be open to postponing Harrison Park. However, what I can't do is leave these schools that are dramatically under enrolled because we've just lopped off their middle grades, or we're planning to lop off their middle grades, leave them hanging for a few years. And Harrison Park is just inextricably linked with the school communities that are feeding to Kellogg. Which is why I think that is work that should be considered sooner rather than later. But otherwise, you know, I agree that we are in an unprecedented moment where we really need to focus our efforts on some other significant things, and importantly on the middle school redesign, because Superintendent, you have always reminded us when we talk about this enrollment balancing work that it really doesn't matter if you're in a K-8 or a K-5 and a middle school. What matters is what's going on in that building. And part of why we're doing this wasn't just reconfiguring for reconfiguring's sake. It was because the program for the middle grade students in our K-8s was not the program that they needed and they deserved. So it wasn't about just creating middle schools. So that to me is the important work that we need to keep our eye on. So I hope that's helpful. And I appreciate you framing this exercise in terms of all of our broader, most important work.
Thank you, Director Constam. We have Student Representative Shu, Director Bailey, Dr. Moore. I think that covers everybody.
It's weird because I'm sort of looking at Nathaniel trying to make eye contact, but that doesn't exactly work through Zoom. So, Nathaniel, did you want to jump in or?
Well, I've got a bit of a question. I'm confused as to why we're talking about these wider questions and broader goals in the context of this work session. I'm sorry if I missed that, but I don't really understand the purpose of this activity.
Yeah, so this activity was meant to, as you think about, our outcome was for the board and the PPS leadership to clarify the top focus areas over the next year around all of the things that we're doing as a system. So we're trying to get students back to school. We're trying to finalize our strategic planning and resource alignment. And then we have some key strategy initiatives. And so how do those sit within the conversation that we were having about enrollment balancing and program balancing?
So what kind of feedback are you looking for? I'm sorry, but
yeah, I mean, so as you think about what we as a central office and as a board should prioritize, right? These areas or enrollment balancing, what are your reflections or what are your thoughts on how we should proceed as a collective?
Well, I think it's obviously important to do the enrollment balancing work for all of the reasons that we have discussed. Just looking at the document, I think it's incredibly important that we also work to implement the 2020 bond, as well as especially the Center for Black Student Excellence. We really cannot put that off anymore. Now that we have passed the bond, it is absolutely critical that we begin that process as soon as possible. I think that's really all of the initial thoughts I have.
Jonathan, can I take a crack? Because I think Nathaniel asked a good question. I haven't heard anybody disagree that we have some really important enrollment and program balancing work to do. The only question is how ambitious, how aggressive do we want to be about the scope of that work in the coming year when we have these other important district priorities? Is it more important than those priorities that we should go really deep on the enrollment work and we're okay with that trade-off? Or do we want to find sort of what the right balance is, because we're talking about a finite capacity that all of us have. And we want to do a quality job. We could do it all, but it won't turn out very well.
I think Director Lowry, Chair Lowry, had a really good point, and human resources and staff burnout are very real. I know many of the staff here have not taken a vacation, for instance, in over a year, and that's concerning to me as a community member and as a board member that cares about people, that no one's been able to take advantage of, even the restorative, a couple of days off without having a phone on you is very, very important right now. I mean, it's not just kids' mental health, it's the adults in the system, and you make better decisions when you're refreshed. And so I'm really concerned about, just doing things. I'd rather do fewer things well and slower than, I think we're looking at these three priority areas, and, like I already said, the opening schools is safely is a huge priority, and it's those other two that I think we need to discuss. How much do we want to are we going to prioritize quantity over quality? I would vote for quality and a slower process, personally.
I just want to appreciate you saying that, Director DePass. There's a reason you only see that very few staff here tonight. And part of that is because I issued a really clear directive earlier today to say, you don't need to be here with everything we have on our plate right now. And it's not because they took the night off. They're in another space doing other planning and work right now to be ready, frankly, for tomorrow's board meeting and other things on their agenda for this week. So I'm trying to be conscious of that too, but I just want to make that clear. That's why you don't see the full cabinet on the screen right now, is there's no other way right now that we're trying to get through these times without sharing some leadership and distributing our energy.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Dr. Moore or Director Bailey?
So I just want to say, for the record, I know Deputy Superintendent Hertz had at least an entire weekend off over Christmas break. So that is That is a joke. And
I don't think Claire. Sorry, Claire's face was like, "What?"
A bad joke. Yeah, Claire's like, "Wait, what?" Yeah, and I hope I've been pretty clear to all of our staff that these are incredibly stressful times, and even before this, I thought people were working at a burnout rate. So I appreciate the question, and I appreciate the priorities posed, and our agreement that they're all important. What I can't judge, because I don't have the information, is just how much, that sort of gradation of how much we can pull off. I'm also left with some contradictions, that this board was in such a hurry to get Creston students into middle school, and I totally get that. And we've had parents at Cesar Chavez who 3 years ago begged us to get their kids into a middle school. And so it's okay to put that off, but we couldn't put off Creston. I just have to point that out. Again, not saying there's a right or a wrong here, but this is some of the things that we're dealing with on the ground level. It's very tough choices that we've had to make all along, in terms of, as I, as a board member, have watched our superintendent and staff leadership rebuild this district from the foundation up, again, with a lot of collaboration from our educators, from our principals, from all our staff in doing that. So I don't know that I can say what I think the priorities are, because I don't have that sense of the weight of, or the range of weights for each of those pieces of work. I really thought it was interesting what Director DePass said about, well, maybe we put some of the strategic planning work on the back burner for right now because we've got so much stuff that's right here. I'd love to hear staff reaction to that as we go forward. To me, yes, reopening is priority number one, doing that well. And secondly, the Center for Black Student Excellence, I think, rises to my second priority, if you had to ask. That's just such a crucial process. And again, this board has made it very clear in our goals that the achievement of Black and Native students is our number one charge. So that to me is a hugely important process. To me, the 2020 bond work outside of that, the pure physical planning and rebuilding of schools, we got the staff to do that. That's going to happen. That's funded. So that's going to happen. I don't worry about that. I think the curriculum adoption process is, as proposed, was really aggressive. And while it's really important, maybe we slowed down a bit on that. Again, looking, just looking at the whole workload, that was going to be a crush already. And maybe we slow it down, and by slowing it down are able to get more collaboration, again, with our educators as part of that process. It makes it easier when the process is a bit slower. And nothing, that's a real area that we can build that collaboration and trust in that adoption, just makes the adoption go that much better, and ensures that we get the right materials that teachers are going to say, yeah, I want a piece of that. I can see where I can use that. So I think this is a great topic to start talking about, but again, Superintendent Guerrero, you're the guy we hire to help make some of those judgments, because you, of all people, know that workload, know the strain, know the level of burnout. I mean, I know it's there, but I don't know how deep that is and how much we need to scale back in that sense. So that's a judgment call that I don't have. That it's really up to you and your staff to talk that through. Again, you know, we're working on this basically a climate sustainability policy right now, and human sustainability to me is really important in terms of how we do this work going forward. So, Cy, there we go. I don't know if that's any help, but that's top ahead.
That's great. I really appreciate it. Dr. Moore.
Director Bailey, I work in sustainability, and so I think that's another reason I'm concerned about it, because that human resources are also finite. So,
Dr. Moore.
So, you know, I'm looking at this piece of paper. I don't see a single thing that I think we can afford to put on the back burner. So I think all of these are critical. I think I would be a little concerned actually if we slow down on the strategic planning process, because I think that's going to help it's going to help provide framework for budget building going forward. And, you know, it may not end up being as finished, polished as you might want it to be at this stage. And that may be one of the things that has to give way, but I think keeping the strategic planning process alive, I think is important. So in terms of how this relates to the phase 2 in Southeast, I do think that we need to go forward with Harrison Park. We have made promises. I don't like making promises that we can't keep. So I do think we need to prioritize that. But I would say beyond that, given realities, I would probably reluctantly be okay with the minimalist brief for the Southeast Guiding Coalition at this point. I think there's, you know, as I've said many times, everything is connected to everything. And if you try to do just a little piece of the larger boundary work at this point, I think it's going to end up, you're not going to be able to contain that and come up with a solution that is going to be both satisfying and meaningful in terms of correcting the imbalances. And it pains me to say this, let me just say that again. But I do think we need to be realistic. Along the same lines, at this point, I wonder about the policy work even around the enrollment policies. Having been down this road before, I can tell you that policy changes are almost as controversial as actually changing boundaries. I have been in those discussions, and I can tell you that school communities I mean, it may be different now because people are maxed out, and I have to say, I admit to being maxed out my own self, so I'm sympathetic. But if we are going to tackle policy revisions, as chair of the policy committee, I want to have some assurance that the policy committee will be able to do that work with real fidelity to the kinds of commitments to equity that we talk about all the time, which may mean proposing or potentially adopting policy changes that could provoke a negative reaction. So, and that's board work primarily, although staff are clearly going to be involved. But it would be helpful to me if my fellow board members could give me some sense of how much time, effort, energy, and pushback they're going to be willing to endure in order to make really meaningful changes in policy. And again, we're talking about creating a foundation for a system that would allow PPS to make regular adjustments. So we're talking about setting a systemic foundation for enrollment balancing in perpetuity. Anyway, so there you go. I think we need to be very clear with the Southeast Guiding Coalition about what we collectively consider to be indispensable work, necessary, essential work that they need to complete, and also some sense of, our collective commitment to allow them to work with fidelity. So.
Appreciate it, Dr. Moore. Superintendent Guerrero, anything that you would like to reflect on or share with the board based on what you heard from all 8 of them?
I appreciated hearing each director. And I guess what it makes me think of is the trade-off doesn't have to be all or nothing in one area. So if you put each priority or initiative on a dial of 10, something might be a 9, something might be a 6, something might be a 4 for the coming school year, but we maintain a level of progress because it is important work and it's something foundational. So I think part of the work that's going to be important for us to reflect on post this conversation is, how do we do that? I think Director Bailey gave a good example. The curriculum adoption is for every content area at every grade level. So maybe we're too ambitious to think in 12 months we're going to do that, but maybe we take math is underway, but maybe we start with 1 or 2 and we really learn from that process and how we engage our teachers. And so it's been many years since they've had any new materials. So people are going to be thankful to finally get some refreshed curriculum. So I think we just have to do a little calibrating internally, and then maybe we come back for a follow-up conversation or in the course of our continued conversations about where we bet high and where we sort of keep the work simmering, and maybe what needs to wait until our schools are open and underway and we can pick that back up again. And what I'm hearing most of all is a consensus around narrowing the enrollment and program balancing work for this next phase. It sounds like Harrison Park sounds like it's critical. And so I think that already sets us on a road where we can start to really dive into sort of then what are the parameters, what are the flexibilities and bumper rails, and how do we think about the questions and the feedback that the Guiding Coalition has presented around what's available to them in the way of iteration, and how do we also pay really mindful attention to the really important community engagement that will need to take place. And so I think that's probably, if that makes sense, a good next level of work. So I appreciate sort of the investment of time and thinking here, because I think it will help to set the stage for this enrollment phase 2, as well as our own staff's sort of calibration of where we put our time and effort in the next 12 months.
Absolutely. Thank you, Superintendent. So the next agenda item or next topic is around community engagement. But given what, there's a finite scope of work around Harrison Park, I think, I'll propose this, and if folks want to continue for another 30 minutes around engagement, but what I would propose is holding an engaged conversation around, holding the conversation now, stopping the conversation, recalibrating, connecting with Claire to really scope out this work based on our conversation, and then come back to you all around a conversation about successes and opportunities related to engagement. I want to put that on the table, knowing that it is 9:15, 9:17. I said that we would try to get out of here by 9:20, but also this is your board meeting, and I want to respect that this is your time to engage.
I'm going to vote for wrapping up now. We've got a long night tomorrow, work day tomorrow. To me, we've hit a logical, we've covered a lot of territory, and I think we can have the next conversation after a reasonable increment of time without having any degradation in the quality of the conversation and the feedback to the community.
Do I hear any opposition to that? I mean, that's a weird question to ask. Is anybody not?
I think this is good.
Good with closing.
Adoption by acclamation.
Great. Well, I just want to thank everybody for allowing me to facilitate you all. I hope I didn't. Yeah, it was a great time. We got a lot accomplished, so really appreciate that. I see Nathaniel's hand up, so I will. Representative Shu.
Thank you. If we're not doing the engagement conversation tonight, I really feel that it is essential that we have this conversation at some point soon. We cannot put it off too long at all.
Absolutely.
So I just had to get that off my chest.
Absolutely.
Nice job facilitating tonight, Jonathan.
Thank you.
Agreed.
Thank you. Chair Lowry, I'll turn it over to you.
I think all I have left to do is officially adjourn us and see you all back here 6 p.m. tomorrow night. Remember, our 5 p.m. session got canceled, so you gained an hour of your life.
Oh my God, what are we going to do with that time?
I think we can all read policies on balance and enrollment with our time.
Prepare for my 6 a.m. call.
All right. Okay, see you all tomorrow. Good.